Before I start, I'm Karabo, and as when I presented myself, I said I am a consultant. So a lot of my presentation is really given perspective from the work that I do as a consultant, various institutions, particularly to speak to women on the ground. So I'm the person who really works mainly in qualitative type of data and not necessarily the numbers. And since the numbers, and I think Prof. Ariel said it, that numbers in this area look different. So I'm just calling out the scientists that we need some form of consistency with the numbers, but more on the qualitative. So the realities, what does this, what do the experiences of women in the agricultural space or in the farming space actually look like in relation to climate change impacts that are happening, but also what some of the case studies we've seen in terms of how digital technology has actually really assisted. So I did a lot of this study and I did a lot of the study with women and particularly with young women in farming. So I just want to also really commend the organizers for having a bit of an intergenerational representation. I'm only 26 years of age, and I really think that it's important for young people to be in this sort of rooms for us to not only learn from you, but to also give you the realities of our experiences while we actually... Ooh, okay, the image just changed. Yes, our realities as we engage with young women in farming, but also our perspectives that we get to see as also people who are on the ground. Outside of consultancies, I really liked the image that Prof. Ariel actually had of the UN one, where there was a woman who was on the ground in a placard. I'm an activist as well. So I also get to really see what we really get to fight for in these rooms, not only from, we're not just the complaining, the rebels and that kind of thing. We do speak on the technical realities that we see, the financial under-resourcing of a lot of the women in farming that they get to experience and really echo their voices that are not necessarily always well reflected in the scientific studies. I do not know what's going on.
It's so dynamic.
Oh.
Focusing all in and out.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, so as mentioned that I think Prof. Ariel really gave perspective, and I'm not really going to go too much into the statistics around agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa and on the continent. It is an essential part of the continent in terms of its GDP contribution, the exports that are happening in relation to what agriculture does, but also employment. And then I want to really give more perspective as to what this means from the perspective of women. For women, this industry, this sector is really, really crucial. The stats are always fluffy. Some say 50 to 70% of the representation is women. So in essence, women are a big component, like Prof. rightfully said, human capital of agriculture on the continent. So therefore, anything that affects productivity and yielding of crops affects women's economic participation within the actual sector itself. That means that outside of all the other many things, which, I'll mention other many things that women actually face in relation to accessing this sector, based on a lot of the barriers that actually exist, whether it's gendered barriers or social norms in accessing the agricultural sector, then we are faced with this new challenge of climate change. So it really exacerbates a lot of the realities that women actually face. Rightfully so, I think that there's greater adaptation for the younger generation, the younger women, and within the studies and the communities we visited, younger women in relation to agriculture are just doing better because of the technology that they're actually using, but also the knowledge that they actually get access to. So climate change is problematic for a lot of the smallholder farmers, a lot of the women farmers, and it's, yes, for everybody, it's a problem, but for women, it's an even bigger challenge because of those social barriers and those social norms that I'm referring to. And climate change just really affects women disproportionately in society. Okay. And I brought a quote from one of the young women farmers who was just speaking about how important it is, how important agriculture is for women on this continent or in Sub-Saharan Africa. She's just saying, for women, farming offers a chance to provide for their families and become financially independent. It also provides an opportunity for women to participate in decision-making processes and be recognized as key players in the agricultural sector. And I think that gives perspective into the question that was asked to say, what does this mean for women at a small scale? So not just market, not just at a large scale, it really means an important, agriculture is really important even from a household perspective. Now, the impact of then climate change would really be doing a big disservice for just the household. So forget about market, forget about value chains, just the household. And a lot of households are women-headed households on the continent. Okay, so, Prof. Ariel did a good job in presenting this part as well, in terms of just agriculture being climate sensitive on the continent and just how we're seeing increasing temperatures on the continent in relation to how it is that they actually will be affecting agriculture, because precipitation is really affected. And there's a quote that I'll also bring up from one of the women that also gives, again, perspectives as to what does this really look like for an everyday young woman who's into farming, as opposed to just, the overall statistics. So the weather, a lot of the women are dependent on rainfall. So rain agriculture is such a big aspect, but climate change has made weather patterns so unpredictable, and therefore makes agriculture very difficult to plan. And also just for seasonal farming, there's just no perspective as to what that looks like anymore. So what is seasonal farming? 1 minute you're expecting it to rain, next minute, the next 10 days it doesn't even rain. So it's so unpredictable, and therefore making it very difficult to rely on rain agriculture. Okay, so ordinarily Africa's climate was, agroecological. So you'll have biannual rainfall or you'll have unimodal rainfall. Now it's a mix and match. It's very unpredictable. When you're not supposed to be having rains in winter, you're having rains in winter. So it's very difficult to also then predict and go farm according to the normal, or what it's supposed to normally look like. And that makes it very difficult to then, you might do seasonal farming and it just doesn't align with the kind of climate that aligns with whatever produce it is that you're doing. And this requires some level of adaptation for women. However, it is very difficult for women in Africa to adapt when all those development gaps actually exist. And I really like the fact that you mentioned lack of institutional support. That is number one on the list, particularly for women in agriculture. We tend to generalize a lot of the issues of climate change for everybody, but we are going to need intersectional and very gender sensitive, solutions to a lot of what is happening, because women in agriculture, unfortunately, while we may say that they're facing everything that any other gender is facing, unfortunately, there's a higher level of vulnerability. There's a higher level of gender sensitive and gender responsive budgeting and approaches that are going to be required. And I had a brief conversation with Grace, and I think she's going to be covering the more gender responsive stuff. Okay, so I think this speaks more on what it really looks like in terms of reduced agricultural productivity. It is really a big reality, and we're seeing a lot of then their ability to then participate in markets and value chains is also then declining. Okay, some of the impacts of climate change, which are not necessarily just the yielding of the crops, that a lot of people don't necessarily get to have conversation about, but rather the woman gets to really face them. Number one is gender-based violence. So a lot of getting into this market leaves a lot of women being left to sexual exploitation because of trying to really continue within this market. They're exposed to a lot of exploitation, particularly from a sexual perspective, because they need to basically obtain certain resources, financials, and a lot of the times those who are willing, who have it, opt for a sexual exchange for them to actually receive those things. Land loss as a result of displacement. On this continent, we already have a big problem with land tenure for women. Women don't necessarily have land tenure, and already when they do and you have displacements as a result of climate crisis, many more women are losing the land that they actually have access to, which is not even a lot in the instance of the tenure we have. And then climate conflicts. A lot of the times, climate conflicts, we're seeing the emergence of climate conflicts. Hence, I was saying I would like to do my PhD in climate security, because a lot of the times when you have climate conflicts, you have men who are the ones who are fighting for land, for water resources, and then women, I guess from a bias perspective or stereotype perspective, women are not necessarily in the conflict themselves. And regardless of where the conflict ends up, you then find a lot of women who are sidelined because then they're excluded or they're overpowered in relation to whatever it is that is being fought for, especially if we're talking water resources. And then where we have a reduction in water resources, they then have to walk miles to really get access to those water. And then same thing in terms of, then it makes it very difficult for them to get into the economies and the markets. And what is even more unfortunate from a market perspective is that the African continent obviously has the Africa Free Trade Continental Area. A lot of women in the agricultural sector are likely going to be left behind, despite that the AFCFTA, as we call it, is going to create market and try and create value chains. But by the time that it's operational in relation to those systems being created, we have bigger issues that a lot of women have been kicked out of the agricultural sector because of climate change having exacerbated the barriers that they actually face. So Snatemba is a young woman who's farming in KZN in KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal happened to have flooding recently, and she was just speaking about just her realities, daily realities, nothing massive. And she's saying that I've seen tangible climate change impacts in my daily work of farming. The weather patterns have become unpredictable, making it difficult to plan when to plant and harvest crops. There are more frequent droughts and floods, which affect crop yields and the overall quality of the produce. The increased temperatures have also led to the spread of pests and diseases that damage crops. And I don't want to take it far into global market, daily living of women who are involved in farming. And this is their realities. This is what they are experiencing. But even on top of this, one of the women that we interviewed when we spoke about climate change, her question was, what is climate change? So there's still an educational gap as to what exactly is this thing that everybody's talking about, and how does this thing really impact my work on a daily basis as a woman in farming? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so then one aspect that has really been quite important in relation to this area has been really climate smart agriculture. The first thing I really do want to start with the last part on this and stretch it to say gender statistics and sex desegregated data is missing. It's highly missing in this area. We tend to really generalize the data in general, which is fine. It's important for us to have that kind of data, but we really don't have gender sensitive data, which makes it very difficult then to address the nuanced experiences that women in agriculture face, especially in the context of how climate change is going to impact women specifically. Outside of women, I guess just intersectionally everybody else. But because my studies about women, we'll say women, even young people who are in farming are affected in a very disproportional way, and it's important for us to have that kind of data. Okay, so then for another aspect is then technical and financial support. While there's so many climate smart agricultural methodologies. We don't have money. And I'm going to say it as money because, when I say financial support, resources, women are not funded. There is not sufficient investment directed towards elevating women's participation in agriculture, particularly that is climate sensitive and also very much sensitive to their realities. So women are underfunded, but also with funding, you require technical support. So how do you use that money? How do you then get into, value chains? How do you maintain those products or technology that we actually use? That is a big component that is actually missing. Okay. Technology. So one of the things within one of the studies that we did was around how digital technology is actually really helping women, provided they obviously have access to it. Most actually just don't have. But for those that actually did have access to some of these, we found that it was really, really conducive in terms of addressing a lot of the stuff. So your water management systems, as I said, that a lot of it is rain agriculture. So a lot of the women that were then invested in and provided these were actually able to really adapt to what is happening, whether it's your arid areas or dry areas, and then dry farming as well, because we're seeing that some parts, particularly those in Central Africa and West Africa, are becoming more drier, and it's important then to adapt to dry farming. So the type of farming, adapting it to the kind of climate and environment that is actually there, despite some of it becoming really unpredictable. And then I think the one that I would say, maybe for me, my favorite one, is the hydroponics and aeroponics. I actually visited one of the facilities. There's quite a lot of that. Let's just say in South Africa as well. They're exploring quite a lot of that, and it's working really well. Expensive, meaning a lot of women then can't access it, but it's one of those that I would highly recommend for addressing a lot of the issues that women in agriculture are actually facing. The woman that her name is Ayanda Zulu, who actually then was working with aeroponics, really happy, really working well. And yeah, it's favorable for a lot of environment, water. So this is where a lot of these have not necessarily been explored in terms of advancing them to women. So what does grey water, the water that we use for bathing, seawater, sewage, water from the air, how can we then capitalize on using a lot of these methods that are new, that are being introduced as digital technology to actually allow women to get into the space? And I have 2 minutes. I will leave it at that. In essence, my presentation really is trying to point to the fact that human capital on the continent in the agricultural space is women. Women are disproportionately affected by climate change. And unfortunately, women don't have access to technology. Women don't have access to financial resources. Women don't have access to technical capacity. Women are just overlooked. And there is a danger in not having gender sensitive, gender responsive approaches to addressing all of these issues. And technology is one of those things that ought to be explored. But if we are bringing up all this technology, we need the money for the technology, and we need to capacitate women to maintain those technologies, to actually push for them to be integrated into whatever it is that they're doing. If we're talking displacement, you then have things like hydroponics, whereby regardless of where they are, they could actually still engage. But women are being affected. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes for questions. I saw that. But turn your name tag. So 3 questions here. Okay.
Thank you, Karabo, for the fantastic job you have done this talk and all this energy and good energy. And I think it's great to have the youth here. It's refreshing. And I have one question that a little bit comes from the ignorance of knowing how things work here in South Africa. So from that perspective, you are talking about women in agriculture. They are the human capital. But we are living in a world that is transitioning very, very fast. Things are changing. We are globalizing. Information now it's global. And my question is very simple. Do really women or the young generations wants to be in that situation, or are in a sense being forced to be in the only place they can be without having any other option? Let's say, what happens instead of going to agriculture, women would like to have the opportunity of become a doctor or a lawyer, or so. What is your perspective on that?
There's a lot of it out there for all of them.
Okay. Steve, I will.
So, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and insightful presentation. I actually like the idea of the women's issues here in your presentation because, I mean, the issue of property rights, women's access to resources that actually prevent productivity increases in agriculture in Africa. I think an issue many people miss when they talk about impacts of climate change is the fact that agriculture also impacts on climate change. Agriculture tends to have negative impacts on the climate, I mean, which I kind of missed for the presentation. Maybe you need to also take that into account. But my question goes in the direction of like, where will you lay the priorities? Because if you think about climate smart agriculture, you have the three principles. You have productivity increases, which we need. You think about mitigation and then the adaptation we're talking about. But there are trade-offs between these three pillars. Where will you put the priorities? Because, I mean, if you actually want to adapt these practices, that would actually reduce the negative impact of the climate change that could also lead to lower productivity. So that is a question. Where will you prioritize?
Investor, please, yes. Hi. Do we have a mic here? Yeah.
Yeah. My, okay. Yeah. Okay.
No, really.
Well, thanks, Karabo, for a very interesting presentation. Okay. Yeah, mine is just a comment. I'm glad that you have highlighted issues related to women. So the work that we have done for the past 42 years is what I've said for me. Directly to if not your work properly. It is true that, I mean, women have limited access to technology, limited access to finance and so on. You recall that, I mean, in this country, the South African government tried to develop various policies, traffic, focusing on women and youth. The problem is that, I mean, they mostly related to cultural barriers. And this is also linked to patriarchal mentality. And especially if you go to rural areas, especially women are not allowed to own land. And there are so many challenges that they are facing. Climate change is just an additional stress top of the socioeconomic challenges that they are facing. And we need to come up with practical solutions. How do we make sure that we accelerate women empowerment? And I'm aware that there are certain programs that are linked to national development, like over about the SDG targets that have been identified by United Nations. So for me, it's just to encourage you to do, deeper analysis and try to come up with practical solutions, because there are problems there. The thing shows that, you still have a long way to go. But how do you make sure that, you address those things? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I'll start from bottom to the top. Thank you so much for the comments, Sylvester. I agree. There are definitely more challenges outside of climate change. There's quite a lot. And yes, I'll take that task upon myself to the practical solutions. And then the second question on priorities. I think gender-sensitive priorities, firstly, would need to be taken into consideration. The fact that for women, particularly women in communities, for them, whether it's us coming with, for them in terms of their priorities are need to put food on the table, it's economic reasons. So a lot of the times then when we then are approaching, whether it's adaptation we are going for, it would have to, and I guess the uptake of those solutions always aligns with that kind of mentality. If you're coming into my community and you're proposing a solution around adapting to the climate, and it's allowing me to ultimately push for the economic part of it, then there's a higher uptake to it. Whereas if you're then coming with a solution around, maybe you want me to raising awareness, I guess is part of the adapting, you want something else that is going to take me away from economic development, that might be the uptake might be a bit different. So I would always suggest the one that pushes for economic development, or at least ensures that they're in a better socioeconomic dynamic. That's the ones that will always have an uptake from women in farming. And then the one on women and youth, whether you're actually interested in the industry, I'd say that I think from an African perspective, there's two parts to it. Firstly, it's quite circumstantial from an economic perspective. If there's a part of I need to put food on the table and this industry exists within my community, I will participate in it. Whether I don't like it, it's not as we say, agriculture is not the sexiest, industry, but it's ultimately from a socioeconomic perspective, it advances me and my family, or my community, and there are resources available, we then participate within it. But as a profession of choice and that kind of thing, I think also just alternatives are also limited. So access to education is another problem. Access to resources and information is another problem. So already that creates an even bigger gap for somebody else. Just even the idea of I want to be a doctor is not even a dream of mine, because my reality is just exposed me to the farming that is in front of me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the inspiring talk. I'm sure that there are many more questions. I have several, but I hold myself, and we will have another opportunity. Thank you.